What is the saddest thing in your family's history? The saddest I know of is when my dad lost two of his brothers. Brother 1 had just gone through heart bypass surgery and fully refused to recover in the hospital. As soon as he could, and against doctor's wishes, he checked himself out and went home. He then took a hot bath, which caused his sutures to rupture internally. His daughter found him in the tub the next day. Brother 2 was flying to Texas for a business meeting when ATC lost his transponder over North Texas. It took searchers 2 weeks to find the wreckage. Best guess is he had a heart attack and crashed in the middle of nowhere. He was flying alone. We find out, once all the information is in, that they likely died within hours of each other. It's the only time I've ever seen my dad cry. My stepdad's oldest brother died and my stepdad died just after driving a long distance to attend the funeral. He was the youngest, and the two middle brothers weren't told that he was dead until the first funeral was over. My dad got diagnosed with cancer. After his third round of chemo he was declared cancer-free, but before he could replenish his white blood cell count he caught pneumonia, which ended up being fatal. Kinda fricked up how he beat cancer and then a relatively common disease ended up killing him. My great-great-granddad hung himself. My great-granddad drove his car off a bridge. My granddad stuck a shotgun in his mouth. My dad threatens suicide constantly. Everyone in the family expects it. Then it's my turn. My great-grandmother died of tuberculosis soon after giving birth to my grandmother. They say she never got to hold her baby before dying. She was only like 25 years old. My great-grandfather made a small beautiful wooden jewelry box with the date she died on, which is one of my family's most treasured possessions. What a beautiful tribute to her, even though it's such a sad story. I can see why it's so treasured. After my grandma died, she ended up buried somewhere, and my father and grandpa not only had to spend 3 weeks trying to find her body, they had to dig her up themselves and take her body to her lot in the graveyard. She was buried in a mass grave in someone's yard, so they had to find her amongst the other bodies buried there. War really as heck. My great-grandmother gave birth to twins who died a few days after, without a christening. They were so poor that my great-grandfather sneaked into the local church at night and buried them under a specific tree. It is now in direct line of sight of my great-grandparents' graves. My grandmother's sister was stolen when they were really young. I don't know the story in detail, but they reunited when they were already grandmothers. Also, during the Japanese invasion in China, the army had reached the region where my grandma lived and she saw soldiers impaling toddlers' kids in the streets at the end of their bayonets just for fun and laughing about it. There's a whole book written about similar things that the Japanese did to the Chinese. My grandfather had an older sister who was epileptic. It was the 60s, and she was dating a boy who convinced her to stop taking her meds, whatever they were, and she ended up having a seizure and dying as a result. She was 16. Found out fairly recently that my great-grandmother had an unnamed baby girl who died soon after birth. Her birth was registered in her surname only. No death certificate that I can find. That was really common before the mid-20th century. When I was in high school I found out that my mom's first child was stillborn. They never named it either, and she wouldn't even say if it was a boy or a girl. I'm not sure what happened to it, but I never heard mention of a gravesite. My grandmother married a man she didn't love. Sad, because if she didn't marry him, I wouldn't be alive, but she gave up someone she loved. First time I'm saying this. My grandmother had a heart attack and was recovering. My grandfather refused to pay for her heart medication. She died from another heart attack not long after. He was having an affair, so I think it was part of his plan. He was my favorite family member and I think about him all the time. I don't know how to reconcile this. I'm so sorry. That must be horrible to go through. The fact my great-grandfather had almost 200 hectares of land back in World War I but had to sell it for a couple of wheat bags. For context, I'm Lebanese and during World War I, we had a deadly famine in the country because of the Allies' blockade of all merchandise, heavy taxation by the Ottomans and destruction of crops by crickets. I'm sorry for that. Can't believe what your family could do with 200 hectares of land these days. But hey, finally another Lebanese redditor. During the Vietnam War, my eldest brother thought that he was lucky because he was sent, as an army veterinarian, to Ethiopia to care of Emperor Haile Selassie's SP prized horses. He served just shy of 2 years there when he was crossing a street in Addis Ababa and was hit by a truck which fled the scene. When we got the news, my mother fainted to the kitchen floor, and it was the first time I ever saw my dad cry. His body was shipped home, but there was some problem and it was stuck in customs or whatever for 6 weeks. My parents were never the same and begged my 2 other brothers, who ended up serving, to not enlist. My great-grandparents, Emma and John, died in the flu pandemic in 1919, within a week of each other, leaving 4 young orphans under the age of 10. Emma's mother, Bridget, took on raising the children. She had a young, teenage son, Jack, and since 5 kids was deemed too many and they didn't want to break up the orphan sibling group, he was sent back to England to live with an uncle and aunt. Jack didn't see his mother again until after the end of World War II. This story has always crushed me. My great-grandmother grew up extremely poor. Think 10 kids in a one-room house poor. When she was 8, her parents saved up and bought her a new church dress. The night before she was supposed to wear it for the first time, her house caught on fire. They didn't have fire departments in that area at the time, so she had to watch her house burn down with her new dress inside of it. It's not the most tragic thing in my family history, but that story has always stuck with me. When you have nothing and you lose what little you have, I'm sure it feels worse than have everything and losing it all, because you know how hard it was to get what little you had. My grandmother, she really should have never had kids, and I genuinely believe that if she'd grown up in today's world, she'd have chosen to be child-free. As it was, she married young and had 5 children, 2 of which were twins. According to my mom, she was never very affectionate and never seemed terribly happy, but she did what was expected of her and raised them all anyway. Now she's in a senior living facility with worsening dementia. The son she did dote on more than the others only comes around when he wants money, and he hasn't gone to see her in a year. He has her car though and went through her house to get everything he wanted. She's in a nice center with friends at least. The crappy uncle didn't want all of her money going to pay for that, because that means much less that he gets when she's gone. Luckily, while grandma was still of sound mind, she made my sister have power of attorney. My sister is an accountant and is making sure my grandma is well taken care of and will be for the rest of her life. It's just sad to see someone who likely didn't want kids go through life doing everything expected of her but never was really happy. My grandfather's uncle was a farmer from Missouri and fought in World War I. Even though farmers were supposed to be exempt from fighting, he was killed in action in Germany the 2nd of November, 1918. A week before the armistice was signed to end the war, his family got a letter from the government informing them of his death, and that they should be proud of his sacrifice. They thought this was extremely condescending, and my dad still sounds bitter whenever it's brought up. Losing 3 family members in a car accident explosion in Houston, colliding with a disabled RV on the side of the road and an 18-wheeler truck. It happened 20 years ago yesterday, the 29th of July. One of the boys was like a brother to me. He was actually alive and on fire when he got out of the burning vehicle. He said something, then died. There is nothing in the world that can fill the hole that left inside my heart. I hope yesterday went okay for you. The 29th of July is a tough day for my family too. My uncle died from osteosarcoma at the age of 49 in March 2015, and he would have turned 54 yesterday. FCK cancer. Sending you a virtual hug. In my family we've only ever had one famous family member. Unfortunately I've never met her. She was a TV and movie star. One day after celebrating she got real drunk and went to go puke her guts out in the toilet. She passed out with her head in the toilet and drowned. My grandfather was a Nazi soldier. This isn't really a sad story, it's more like a true love story. My grandfather married my grandmother, who was a Jew. He saved her from getting captured and brought to Bergen-Belsen. They then went on and immigrated to the US to get married. They stay with us now since they are growing old, and every Wednesday we go to get ice cream. It's the cutest thing. 9 of my ancestors were killed by the Russians in World War II. Only 3 of them were soldiers. My great-grandaunt went down with her 2 little childs when the Wilhelm Gustloff sunk. 10,000 people died in this ship, and what happened? The Russian submarine commander who sunk the ship became the title hero of the Soviet Union, a hero who killed 10,000 civilians. My grandmother fled out of Pommern. I don't know how it is called in English. The only thing she has from her old home is one bracelet. Pommern in English is Pomerania. My family is from the Philippines. My grandfather on my mom's side was the youngest in his family. After World War II, his older siblings stole all his inheritance and left him dirt poor. He became depressed and an alcoholic. When he had a family, they were still dirt poor. My mom's aunts and uncles treated her like a maid without the pay and made her sleep in chicken cooperative. All is well now. My mom is a superhero and was able to get her PhD in the USA. The family who stole my grandpa's inheritance are having trouble keeping up financially as their wealth is slowly dwindling down. LOL. I would totally read your mom's autobiography. She sounds like she's light years beyond amazing. In the 50s, my mother had a cousin that was abducted by 3 men, taken up into the hills in central BC, Canada. She was tied to a tree and repeatedly raped for about a week until she was murdered. I don't have a lot of other information as it's not something the family talked about. My mum and grandma were diagnosed with breast cancer in the same week. Mum's cancer was treatable and caught early. Grandma's was terminal. It was a rough few months and we were all holding out hope that she would make it to her 80th birthday, and we had planned a big party and family get together that would be the last before she died. She survived to her birthday, but never made it to the party because her husband, my granddad, died that same day out of absolutely nowhere. Did I mention it was also the 20th anniversary of my other grandma's death? I'm still finding out little by little. But my dad served for about 8 years in Desert Storm, Desert Shield. He used to deny being in the army. Then he said he was never active. Now he admits he was active but never fired a gun. My mom told me that he broke down once when they saw a movie, forget which one, and an IED blast scene happened. Dad freaked out and they went home. He admitted to some more stuff. He's shot at people and been shot at. Mom and I think he's killed someone. I know he faced child soldiers. He just won't give full details. She found out recently that 2 men under his command were killed in front of him from an explosion. My dad's a type of guy to give you the shirt off his back, but he's spent years hiding the horrors he's seen. I'll never push, but I hope he knows he can talk to my mom or I about it. My dad saw some crap in Desert Storm too. My mom made him go to counseling or she was going to leave him. Luckily I was pretty young so I don't remember much about him at that point, or I was too busy with preteen girl drama. He still doesn't talk about it to us, but I think he got the help he needed to deal with it in a healthy way. My direct ancestor was a general in the American Civil War for the Confederacy and I am named after him. Well, I'm named after my uncle who was named after his grandfather who was named after him. There are statues of him to this day. Prior to the Civil War our family were big time slave owners, like the 1% of the 1% rich, US senators in your back pocket powerful. Despite being a white guy, I have a very commonly black last name. I feel sorry for people that don't put it together right away when they notice why a white guy would have a black person's last name. A large portion of that half of the family is still very, well, stereotypical Ozarks racist that speak of the Confederacy in a positive light. For my immediate family that has nothing to do with the rest. It's a dark part of our history, but I feel strongly that it should not be hidden because to pretend it didn't happen is almost as bad as attempting to justify it. I think my grandma's life, starting when she was around 30, is pretty sad. My dad's dad suffered a freak head injury playing basketball with his friends, resulting in a pretty significant change in personality and severe mood swings. My grandma felt it was dangerous for their children, so she packed up her things, tossed their 6 children in their tiny truck and drove across the state in a night to stay with her sister. My grandpa followed after to try to bring them back, but my grandma refused and he eventually left. My grandma then proceeded to take on 2 jobs to help support all 7 of them. They had so little money that they had to live in my great aunt's attic bedroom until she could afford to buy them a small 2-bedroom home. This was all during the 1950s and 60s in Midwest USA, when it was not typical for women to be raising their children alone. much less following a separation and divorce. My grandma passed away in February 2017. She spent the last several years of her life fighting debilitating dementia and Alzheimer's. She didn't know who she was, where she was, who we were, how to cook, how to eat, how to dress, or, if she did know, she couldn't remember how to say so. She deserved a better end than that after all the good she did for her kids and her kids' kids. Our entire extended family owes our health and happiness to her resolve in the face of adversity. My mother was raped repeatedly from age 8 to 12 by her older brother of 1822. She was then sent to live with another older brother, 28, and his fiancée, where she was again raped repeatedly until the age of 14, when she was able to get away. It gets weirder than that. A year or two later she was living with her mother again, whom got very ill and was taken to hospital where she lapsed into a coma. My mother and her younger brother were sitting by the bed when their mother woke from her coma, sat up in bed and pointed the younger brother and said, "You're going to die." She then lapsed back into her coma and died the next day. Around a fortnight after that, my mother came home from work to find her younger sister in a panic because the brother was very sick with bad pains in the head and slurred speech, etc. My mother went into his bedroom to find him in bed crying, and when she asked what was wrong, he told her he'd seen his mother sitting in the corner telling him he was going to die again. He was taken to hospital hours that, and later diagnosed with an aggressive form of brain cancer. He died with a couple of months. There's so much more tragedy in her life, but I'm not 100% on the specifics and people will get bored if I make it too long. Oh my gosh, I've got shivers. That is heartbreaking. My dad and his siblings were separated as kids due to abuse from their father and their mother's mental breakdown. They all grew up in different foster homes or schools for kids who went through trauma. My granddad's cousins, I think, were made to join the Hitlerjugend and German army even though all of them considered themselves Polish. They all died during their service, except for one, who got ill and was sent home, where he died shortly after. He's the only one with a grave. My grandfather's uncle, let's call him Raj for simplicity, was an Indian freedom fighter during British rule in India. But he wasn't a peaceful Gandhi man. He was a part of an armed group that got into skirmishes with British soldiers and officers. One day he was making a bomb in his home. I'm not sure about what its intended use was, but killing British people is the basic assumption. The bomb exploded whilst he was making it, which killed him and blinded his wife. After independence, the family of dead freedom fighters were awarded government support, but Raj was labeled a militant. She was kicked out her in-laws' house after a few years as they didn't want her around. Her own family wouldn't take her back due to the nature of her husband's death. My grandfather took her in. As a member of the family, living on the streets would be bad for reputation. Everyone, grandfather included, treated her like a pest and never cared for her. My dad was just a child, but he remembered her to be a wonderful, caring lady, and he was the only one who ever liked her. His one regret in life was not being able to care for her. She contracted the flu in her 70s and no one bothered to take her to the hospital or get her medication. It worsened and she died from it. She died a blind, penniless widow who was treated as a nuisance by her own family, and her death was completely avoidable had someone cared. I've been reading these all evening and this one in particular touches my heart. May she rest well. A great aunt had a sweet 16th birthday dance. It was her first important day in her life. Because it was on the plains, people had to come in by wagons to attend. Because it was winter and no lights, people had to stay for 2 days. It was a big deal. Also, from here she could start courting. She danced, would get sweaty, go outside to cool off, and then come back inside. She caught pneumonia and died a few days later. She caught something that gave her pneumonia from the guests. Despite popular misconception, you don't catch colds or flu or pneumonia from cold air or from getting wet. They come from bacteria and viruses. She could have gotten hypothermia, I guess. That is very sad, however. We don't have careers. It's almost like we just exist to consume media, buy crap and eat food, like everyone else. I can't recall anything significant that we've ever done, and my parents were just dropouts. My grandfather has a pretty tragic background. He's watched so much loss. I can't blame him if every day he has a thought that he wished he'd just go. Someone murdered his son. so I never got to see that uncle. Loses his wife of about 43 years together. He loses his long-term girlfriend, second option besides his wife, inevitably. Loses his close pets, particularly a couple dogs he had. Loses a son-in-law to suicide. One of my other uncles. It's just all he knows in his life is just loss. You don't need a career to be significant. Find something you love. Do it. It will be significant to you. Find something you love and can share with someone else. It will be significant to them as well. The losses and failures of those around you are not yours. Grandma married Grandpap because he bought her a new pair of underwear. See, she was the youngest, and her drawers weren't exactly new by the time she got them. Yay, Appalachia. On the other hand, she refuses to talk about her grandmother, like, won't even tell us her name, and we all suspect it's because she wasn't white. Grandpap won't talk about his family at all, although we do have some paperwork from Ellis Island. They're both about to hit triple digits, and when they are gone, all that information goes with them. My mother's father was horribly abusive. He was a raging alcoholic, was suspected of doing drugs and uses all their money for his gambling addiction. He was arrested and spent a long butt time in jail. Then after he was washed up and divorced, he tried contacting my mother, then tried to get to me, his granddaughter. Told my mother that I would be better off with a real parent like him. My grandmother is currently engaged to a man named Brad. He's a self-entitled, self-absorbed prick. He insulted something at my uncle's wedding and got his butt beat and kicked out. He wants to micromanage my grandmother and seems to hate me. Told my grandmother she wasn't allowed to come to my 8th grade graduation small art school because he didn't have one. Thinks my short hair is the devil's work and insults my pagan aunt to heck. He thinks that when Grammy dies he gets all her stuff and her house and we can't have anything. And he's already planning to sell it all. Grammy is 54. He also voted for Trump and tried to use my grandmother's absentee vote to go to Trump as well. He has said on multiple occasions that if Grammy ever brings my uncle around he has the right and will shoot him for what he did. My uncle was defending Grammy. Brad pushed her to the floor in her own home just before the wedding and seriously hurt her. My grandmother was the youngest of 15 and grew up on a farm. Both of her parents died within a few weeks of each other when she was 12, and during those few weeks her dad blamed her for her mom's death. She died of cancer. Once her parents died, her older brothers made her drop out of school, which she loved because it was her escape and she was a very talented artist, to work on their farm. She was made to do all of the hard labor until she met my grandpa when she was 16. He told her he would marry her to get her out of that hellish situation. They were so happily married for 60+ years up until my grandpa died in 2008. So it starts out really sad, but has a happy ending. My great grandfather was a severe alcoholic. He was living in a flop house and got drunk, fell down the stairs, and broke his neck. It was the beginning of the Great Depression, and my great grandmother was trying to work things out because they had 5 children. The oldest was 16, 14, and 11. Those 3 went to work in the textile plant to feed the family. The youngest 2, my grandfather 7, and his brother 5, went to a home for orphaned boys. My great uncle ended up coming home a couple years later, but my grandfather stayed and graduated from the school that was part of the orphaned boys school. My grandfather's brothers were both killed by the same alcoholism that killed my great grandfather. My grandfather was an abusive alcoholic who damaged 3 of his kids, my mom and 2 uncles, so thoroughly that they are incapable of having healthy relationships with anyone, including their kids. 4 of the 5 kids have addiction problems. So, familial alcoholism is the saddest story. My dad had a younger sibling that died of a respiratory infection when he, the sibling, was around a year old. The doctor that tended to him, small town, early 1940s, one doctor that did house calls, stated later that the baby could have been saved, but that since the family was very poor and already had 8 children that they had enough children already. Back in the 1940s my great uncle was raped and murdered by another family member. He was only 15 at the time. Back then, this type of crime was investigated. The report said that he accidentally drowned, but my mom always said that was BS. Late to this one, but the story is worth telling. I had a cousin who committed suicide because he was gay and trapped in a family that was ready to disown him completely the moment he turned 18. He didn't make it that long. His family burned everything that belonged to him, destroyed every picture. They still buried him in an unmarked plot. Roger's his name. May it live long past the crap family that all but murdered him. My great-great uncle immigrated from the Philippines to the US after fighting with the guerrillas and US Army. He was promised compensation retirement from the US but never received it. Ended up working for two very kind wealthy white ladies who decided to give their workers a small staff of all POC, their inheritance since they had no other family. We don't know numbers, but since they lived in a mansion and had live-in staff, it would have been a decent amount. When they both passed, their white lawyer altered the will so he got all the money and left the hard-working staff nearly penniless without a home. It was sadly 1950s-60s. Even if they could afford a lawyer or pie, there's no way a jury would take their side. The saddest part for him wasn't missing the money, but the fact that the lawyer took advantage of the death of two kind old women to basically crap on their last wish of wanting to reward the people that cared for them. I really hope karma bit his butt. As far as I'm aware of, my mom, she grew up the youngest of 6, and a small tomboy. She has told me over the years, essentially, that her father was abusive physically, sexually, and emotionally, and that he allowed at least one family friend to do the same to her. In school, bullies would force a boy to fight her so that the bullies wouldn't beat him up. My mom says she usually won. To be fair, my dad cheated on her. Her next partner was domestically abusive, in front of me, and threatened to hurt her. Her next husband raped her while she was asleep, with me in the house. Her last partner of 7 years ended up being a super terrible match and generally very bad for her mental health. Now she lives alone in a home she said she never wanted to move back to. Her ferret who she loves just disappeared, and she came home to find one of her indoor-only cats run over and stuck to the road outside her home. I've been writing her eulogy since I was about 13, but this dang woman just keeps on going. I have struggled hard with stuff, but nothing like my mom. She raised me basically on her own. I love her so goddamn much, but she's alone a lot and I have lived in constant fear that she'll end her life before it's time. She's an EMT. She saves lives and makes virtually no money for 80 hours a week. She tends a modest garden and loves her projects. I want to give her the world, and I just hope that one day I get the chance. Your sentiments towards your mom are beautiful. I hope you share with her how much you admire and love her for her resilience and everything she has done for you. I'm sure she would value that, even if you can't help by providing material things. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.